Dear doctors, we are live now.
Good evening. Uh, I welcome all of you to today's session. This program W3 webinar series, that is what, why, and when of management of PCOS patient, is organized by the PCOS Society of India. This is a case-based multidisciplinary series of webinar started since January 2021 and will be conducting once a week. The objective of this session is basically to focus on the practical management of PCOS. And to start with today's webinar, lean versus obese PCOS, is there really a difference? We have with us a very eminent panelist from a different specialization to discuss the pertinent questions and also throw light on the practical management of PCOS. And to moderate today's session, we have with us Dr. Shobna Patel. Dr. Shobna Patel is the director, Patet's Fertility and Research Center. She's a president, Kisar. She's been a former president of Kasoga 2019-20. And she also has many firsts in her list, like the first fertility center in Karnataka to get NABH accreditation, the first center to start fellowship in reproductive medicine in North Karnataka, and the first center to have PGTA baby in North Karnataka. As well as she has many awards to her list. Well, over to you, madam. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of PCO Society of India, I welcome you all for this very interesting webinar. This is called as an W3, that is what, when, and why, an interactive case-based discussion on PCOS. As we all know, PCOS is a complex syndrome and there is no single diagnostic criteria. There is hyperinsulinemia and there is hyperandrogenism. It is called as a metabolic malady. It's a mother of all lifestyle disorder. We know that there are two phenotypes. One is a lean PCOS and another is the obese PCOS. Though majority of the patients have obese PCOS, but a small and significant portion of PCOS are also lean. So today we are going to discuss about, is there a difference between a lean and a obese PCOS? So I have with me the eminent specialist from various specialty. I bring best wishes from PCO Society. Dr. Durusha is the founder president of the PCO Society of India. I must say that PCO Society of India is doing exemplary work. It is a multi-speciality society which deals with multidisciplinary people, and we have gynecologist, endocrinologist, dermatologist, nutritionist, physiotherapist, bariatric surgeon, bariatric physician. All people who deal with PCO are members of this society. And it was launched in 2015, and they are doing such an exemplary work in creating awareness about PCOS. And if you are not a member, I really urge you to become a member of this society. Now I have the honor of introducing the expert for this panel. First, let me introduce Dr. Rajshekhar Naik. Dr. Rajshekhar Naik is a director and consultant surgeon at Gunashila Surgical and Maternity Hospital, Bangalore. He has been the assistant professor at Bangalore Medical College. His special interest is advanced minimal access GI surgery and bariatric surgery. And as we all know, that Gunashila is one of the premier institute for ERT management in Karnataka. And being associated closely, being his own hospital, so he has been closely associated with management of infertile patients with morbid obesity. And I'm sure we are all going to be benefited a lot by when he shares his experience about about his management of morbid obesity with infertility. Dr. Vikrant Gatnati, a brilliant endocrinologist from Belgaum. He has done his DM from Guwahati. He was awarded the gold medal in medicine. He has also received the best outgoing postgraduate in medicine award. And he is one of the very, very busy sought after and busy endocrinologist of our place. Dr. Sheila Nambiar, she has a very interesting, unique profile. She is a gynecologist, but her CV slide doesn't say anywhere that she is a gynecologist. And it is interesting that, you know, she has, being a gynecologist, after that she has got a board certified lifestyle medicine physician. She has got this from the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. She is also a fitness consultant, and she has also done her positive psychology course from UPenn University. Currently, she is the president of Indian Society of Lifestyle Medicine, and she has written many books, and they are all available on Amazon. And I think they are all. I think Fit After 40 is definitely. I recommend that you must read, and it's worth reading. And I must. And when I had a discussion with her, how she moved from being a gynecologist into this holistic physician, I had a lot of interesting thing to learn from her, and I'm sure she's going to contribute a lot to this webinar. Dr. Neeta Deshpande, a diabetologist and a bariatric physician and a good friend of mine from Belgaum. She's a professor of and professor HOD of medicine, MM Dental College, Belgaum. She's the most sought after speaker in all the diabetes conference. So every day she's in one conference, and that's how I know how busy Neeta is. And she has a lot of flair for for social media, and I really appreciate that. And she has made several presentations, and she has several publications, and she has been a principal investigator for several clinical trials. Dr. Ruby, is Ruby Sound. She's a consultant dietitian. She's a founder of Eatwise Nutrition and Wellness Clinic. She's also a managing committee member of the PCO Society India. And currently she's the secretary of Indian Dietetic Association, Mumbai chapter. She has been a lead facilitator of She's Ambassador program, educating nearly 50,000 school girls, adolescent girls on nutrition and menstrual health. Welcome, Ruby. So I have we also have Dr. Shweta Patil, who is an young upcoming ART specialist. She's in charge of the Assisted Reproduction Center in KLE Hospital, and she's also working as an assistant professor. She has received a fellowship in reproductive medicine from Kraft Hospital, Kerala. So Shweta, I request you to can you please present the case, and yes. So we'll start with our discussion.
Yes. Okay. Good evening again. So I'll be our first case. She's a 21-year-old woman. Case of primary infertility, married for 2 years. She came with a complaint of irregular cycles since menarche. She had attained menarche at the age of 12 years. She was diagnosed to be having hypothyroid, and since then she's on tab thyroxine 25 microgram. And her on examination, her BMI was 17, waist circumference 80 centimeter. Her Ferriman Galway score was 5 with severe acne. Acanthosis nigricans was not seen, and on her hormone evaluation showed the following report. Her thyroid was TSH was 4.68, prolactin 20.7, free testosterone 0.0317 nanomole per liter. DHEA is 442.2 microgram per deciliter. AMH came to be 10.4 nanogram per ml. Vitamin D and vitamin B12 was done, which was normal. We did a transvaginal ultrasonography wherein it showed her uterus was normal. Her right ovarian volume was 11 centimeter cube with an antral follicular count of 22, and the left ovarian volume of 10.7 with an AFC of 26. Her other investigation like HSG and her male evaluation was normal.
Thank you, Shweta.
Yes.
So my first question goes to Dr. Vikrant. Could you please comment on the clinical profile of this patient?
And good evening, everyone. As we can see from the history, this is a very classical presentation of a patient with polycystic ovarian syndrome. You have a young lady who's presented with all the 3 characteristics, the oligomenorrhea. There is clinically hirsutism, as you can make out from the FG score of 5. And she has acne also, which is another manifestation of hyperandrogenism. And she has a polycystic ovarian morphology on ultrasound. So these are the three key considerations as per the Rotterdam criteria that we should have in a PCOS. Since she has all the three, she fits into classical PCOS phenotype. But the point worth noting here is that her BMI is around 21, which is quite less. So she falls into this lean PCOS category. Another worthwhile point to be noted here is, though she has a BMI of 21, though she falls into the lean category or a non-obese category of PCOS, her waist circumference is 80 centimeter, which again falls in the slide, suggestive that she has increased visceral adiposity. And
just as her BMI is 17 actually, Vikrant. So how are these PCOS different from obese PCOS in terms of clinical profile? So what do you think that the difference between this lean PCOS and obese PCOS as far as the clinical profile is concerned?
Yeah. PCOS, as we know, like obesity is almost one of the accompanying clinical feature in PCOS, but of course, there is a subset of PCOS who are not obese, and we call them as lean PCOS, someone who has a BMI of less than 23. And in terms of differentiation, in terms of clinical profile, since these patients have lesser lean body weight, you tend to see the hyperandrogenism is less severe in them when compared to the obese PCOS. The oligoovulatory or menstrual irregularity also is quite less when compared to obese PCOS. And in terms of metabolic parameters, what you can see is, again, because of the decreased insulin resistance, the serum fasting insulin levels or the metabolic parameters in terms of lipid profile are slightly less deranged when compared to obese PCOS. Though you see insulin resistance in these lean PCOS as well, but compared to obese PCOS, the amount of insulin resistance is less. And as a result, the metabolic parameters also are significantly better when compared to obese PCOS.
Okay, thank you. So it's basically lean PCOS, to differentiate clinically, what you're telling is their weight is either normal or they're underweight as compared to the obese PCOS.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So if you look at the statistics, 5% of all lean women may have PCOS, and 20 to 30% of women with PCOS are of average weight or lean. So 70% or 70 to 80% of the PCOS may be overweight or obese, but 20 to 30% of the patient with PCOS are they are either of an average weight or a normal weight or lean. So women with lean PCOS are often undiagnosed. So, and they present a therapeutic challenge. So is the classification of BMI different for Asian Indians as compared to the Western counterpart? And I would want Neeta to answer this question. Can you tell us, like, is the BMI different? And if it is different, why so?
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Shobna. Well, yes, it is different. A few years ago, it was decided that Asia Pacific region itself, which India is included in, needs to have different cutoff points. And the reason for that is that they have seen that the visceral fat is far more as compared to what the BMI is suggesting. Normally, the BMI suggests that the fat is more. But what is the typical Asian Indian phenotype that you see is that BMI wise, they may be much less, but they, just like you're seeing in this particular patient of yours, where the BMI is 17, however, the waist circumference is 80. So the cutoff point is 80 centimeters for women in Asia Pacific guidelines. So because of this typical Asian Indian phenotype, it was seen that the risks for metabolic diseases is more even at lower BMIs, and hence the cutoff was lowered. So 23 is the cutoff for overweight in the Asia Pacific guidelines, as you can see very well over here. And 25 and above is obese with two different classes. Whereas for the Western population, this is 25 and 30 respectively. So they're all downgraded. And the same goes for waist circumference as well. The waist circumference cutoffs are also less for Indian population because they have far more worse metabolic profiles at lower levels of waist circumference and BMI.
Thank you, Neeta. So it's a very, very important point. All of us have to note that you cannot have the Western standards for the classification of BMI in Indian setup. So this is one thing definitely we need to understand, that anything more than 23 is taken as overweight. Anything more than 25 is taken as obese. So this is what, like Neeta was telling about this, like in obesity in Indians has got unique features. Body fat is significantly more than the Western counterpart. Central obesity is more common. They are called as metabolically obese, normal weight individuals. They may have a normal weight, still they could be metabolically obese. They have more fat and less muscle, and that is the what exactly Neeta said. They are called as Asian Indian phenotype. Okay, now we'll come back to the very basic question. How do we define obesity? Sheila, can you please tell us, like, how do you define obesity?
Thank you, Shobna. So as Neeta said, according to the classification, BMI is the standard that we're using currently, where we know that over 25 is considered as obese. Since we are using only BMI, the thing to remember is that we're not really looking at the fat percentage of the person. So like for this woman, while her BMI is well within normal, in fact, it's quite low, her fat percentage may be higher. So I think what we need to also consider is look at the fat percentage to identify if fat percentages are above normal or not. So while the definition of obesity only uses BMI, we as clinicians, I think, need to keep in mind that fat percentage, waist circumference is also very important. So by and large, I think we can use the standard tabulation that we just saw, where above 25 is considered obese. But it would really benefit all of us, including the patient, if we can keep fat percentage and waist circumference in mind.
You said a very, very valid point. You said obesity. Obesity is just overweight? Is obesity overweight?
Well, the
belief is just overweight, but probably in, if we really have to define obesity, they have defined it as if the fat percentage is greater than 25% of the total body weight, the person is considered as obese. So having known this, why my question to all of you is, can we measure the fat percentage in a woman? We know that, that it's not only the BMI, the fat percentage is so very important. Do we have any tools by which we measure the fat percentage? Some, fat analyzer, like, body composition analyzer or something like that. Do we have that? Are we all using this in your practice? I want to know from each one of you, how are you defining, or how are you diagnosing obesity? Is it only BMI, or like, is it you're taking the waist circumference, or you're using a fat analyzer like this? Can we start with Dr. Rajshekhar Naik?
Yeah, I think rather than a fixed number for obesity, I think you should take the entire person into consideration. You have to look at the clinical picture, you have to look at the comorbidities, and then obviously the weight. And in the weight, there are a lot of ways to measure the exact fat percentage, but most of them are not practical and they are too expensive, like the MRI and DEXA scan. You can't do it for every patient. So what we do is we do waist circumference and BMI in the hospital, but we also give a lot of importance to the entire clinical picture of the patient, and not just their BMI or whether somebody is obese or not obese. So it is a clinical plus weight and the waist circumference. In the Asians, obviously we know that if you take a 70 kg Caucasian and a 70 kg Asian, is a very common slide that most people show. You'll see that the fat percentage in Indians is very, very high, and it's visceral fat. And it's visceral fat that's more important than the overall body fat that gives rise to comorbidities. So I don't use any of these fancy body composition analyzers. They are very nice to show the patient a good printout. But the only role for that, I would feel, is that if you do have it, then you can monitor the patient over a period of time and see the trend, whether the patient is doing well according to your expectations or not.
Okay, thank you. Neeta, do you do this fat body composition analysis?
Yes, actually I do. I use, although it is not the most accurate method, but for clinical practice and for guiding therapy, it is fine. I'm using the bioimpedance analysis, which is a 4-lead machine. You also have those handheld ones.
Yeah.
And you also have this 4-lead one. So the handheld ones are not very accurate. They're even more, they're quite inaccurate, in fact. So if you have a 4-lead machine, like the in-body machine that I use, you can get some idea of the, fat percentage, and you can track it. Of course, there are a lot of caveats to it. The water content has to be right, because if the water content is not right, then your this one can get skewed. So it is not for use in clinical trials, but to keep a track of the fat percentage, it's not a bad place to start, actually. We also use surrogate markers, Shobna, like waist hip ratio. Then we also use skin calipers, where we do the subscapular skin fold thickness. Then we do the mid-arm skin fold thickness. So these ratios also give us an idea of subcutaneous to visceral fat.
So routinely you do, or it is done only on any trials when we are doing, are we doing that?
No, fat percentage analysis we are doing for all patients.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sheila, are you using that?
Yeah, I actually have a fat percentage machine in my fitness studio, not in my hospital. In the hospital, we use girth as well as the skin caliper. So there are girth measurements around, for waist, arm, thigh, hip, neck, etc., as well as the skin caliper, like Neeta explained. So we're doing the girth and skin caliper routinely for patients.
So, but we need to understand that they are not very accurate, and then you should be cautious about that, right?
They're good for, like Neeta said, they're good for measuring progress, because sometimes the weighing scale may not really show much of a difference. But when the patient recognizes the, falling number of inches around the waist, right, or even around the arm, it is also encouraging for her, motivating for her. So it's good to give her several parameters by which we can identify if she's losing weight or not.
So one more condition I wanted to share with you all. Some patients, they say they are on diet, they are on exercise, but the BMI doesn't change at all. They keep, BMI remains same, and they are exercising. So when you look at this analyzer, you find that, the fat percentage is falling down, but the BMI, it remains same. So probably, do you think that in that condition, because the muscle, it's that muscle weight is increases, the fat percentage comes down. So when we look at it, will you be able to tell when you have an analyzer, whether she's improving or not? Her BMI might not change. Let's say that her fat percentage comes down and the muscle mass is increasing because of her exercise. So the BMI remains same. Possible?
Yes, ma'am. So I would like to add here that yes, in my practice, I used all the 3 devices. One is the measuring scale, the skin caliper as well. So especially for women who are lean, their weight and their BMI may be normal. But if they see the fat percentage, especially this, we have seen the young college going girls. So we have analyzed a lot of young teenager girls. They may look lean and thin, but they all have high body fat percentage, and especially the visceral fat. So when you use this tool as comparison, they may not be 100% accurate as DEXA scan, but yes, it definitely shows them, yes, they are having a higher consumption of saturated fats, trans fats, then they have a high visceral fat. And that really helps them in, it helps in guiding them in which direction they're going. And suppose if they're doing a good resistance training, and I think Dr. Sheila will agree, if they continue doing good resistance training, they see an increase in the muscle mass. Yeah. And even if their BMI remains stagnant, they see a drop in the fat percentage. I think that really, hits the insulin resistance, and it really is a useful tool, I would say. And in my clinic, like what Neeta ma'am is using a 4 sensor machine, which is not very expensive. So it just takes 30 seconds to do it for any patient who walks into our clinic.
Okay, thank you.
I would also like to add that you will also see a clinical response, isn't it? That
yes,
in addition to the numbers that you see on these machines, you will see a clinical response. When these girls actually lose weight, their menses may become regular, and a whole lot of things that you may observe. That also, I think, has to be kept in mind.
Yeah. So now we'll come. So now will be what are the best measures to diagnose obesity? The same thing we are going to conclude. Sheila, please.
Yeah, your weight, yes, it can be used as just a method of assessing. It's not obviously the weight on the scale does not give us the whole picture. We can't recognize whether it is fat weight or muscle weight, but having that number is also important. BMI definitely, waist circumference most certainly. We can take a few other circumferences as well, like the arm, hip, thigh, neck, etc., because those are the areas where people normally accumulate fat. And if you have a fat percentage machine, like Neeta and Ruby and Dr. Rajshekar also had mentioned, it's not very accurate, but it's great to assess progress. So all of that can be used. I think we need to use more than one measure.
So this is, I think Sheila would take this question, and this has been shared by Dr. Sheila. And she said, like, you know, that this waist to height ratio predicts insulin resistance in 71% of women with PCOS. And these are apps which are available. Are you using it routinely, Sheila?
Yeah, I use some of the links that can, by means of which you can assess the fat percentage with Girth, using Girth.
Okay. So this also can be used to look for insulin resistance. So the next question is, this patient had evidence of clinical hyperandrogenism. Is it necessary to test for biochemical hyperandrogenism in this woman? This is for Dr. Vikrant.
Yeah, since this lady here already has clinical evidence of hyperandrogenism in the form of hirsutism, doing a biochemical test to establish the same would not be of much help. The assessment of biochemical hyperandrogenism is most useful in the diagnosis of PCOS, where the clinical signs of hyperandrogenism, like especially hirsutism, are unclear or absent. When you don't have clinical evidence of hirsutism and you want to establish that there is biochemical hyperandrogenism, that is when the biochemical test like testosterone or free testosterone would be helpful. The other place where a biochemical test to look for hyperandrogenism would be useful is when somebody presents with, say, severe hirsutism. They have a FG score of more than 9. Then these women may have an androgen secreting tumor, or there may be cases of non-classical CAH, which are mistaken as polycystic ovarian syndrome. We should remember that polycystic ovarian disease is a disease of exclusion. So non-classical CAH, adrenal secreting, these all should be ruled out before we make a diagnosis of polycystic ovarian syndrome. So that rarely, when you do testosterone in these cases, getting a testosterone level of, say, more than 200 nanogram per dl will give you a clue that probably PCOS is not the reason for hirsutism in these women, and it could be a case of non-classical CAH or androgen secreting tumor. So these are two instances, ones where you have severe hirsutism and you want to know what could be the etiology of hyperandrogenism or hirsutism in such cases, where testosterone levels will help. The other condition or the other setting where it will help is somebody who has absolutely no evidence of hirsutism and has presented with features of oligomenorrhea, just to establish a diagnosis of PCOS. In such cases, we would like to do tests for biochemical hyperandrogenism.
Okay. So if there is a clinical hyperandrogenism, it is not necessary to do a biochemical hyperandrogenism. So
exactly.
We are planning to test for biochemical hyperandrogenism. So which androgen do we test? There are a series of androgens that can be tested. So, like, you know, what is your take on that? Which androgen we need to test? And the problem with this is, like, you know, there is lack of clarity on which androgen to measure. And then there's a lot of overlap between the normal and then abnormal values. And the kits are also not very specific. So do you want to tell which androgen needs to be measured?
Exactly, ma'am. There is a lot of controversy regarding regarding which androgen levels to be should be measured, or which one of them should be measured to diagnose PCOS. The androgens that are secreted in the body are mainly testosterone, DHEAS, and androstenedione. DHEAS is the androgen which comes from exclusively from the adrenal gland. Androstenedione is another hormone which comes from the adrenal gland. So there are either you can measure testosterone or free testosterone. Most of the guidelines, they concur that free testosterone should be measured over scores for all the other androgenic markers in diagnosing PCOS. But one caveat here is that free testosterone should be measured using equilibrium dialysis, which is usually not available in the centers, and it is equilibrium dialysis is something which is done in very higher centers. So among the best marker practically would be to have a free androgen index. We can calculate the free androgen index by doing a total testosterone and a SHBG and then getting a free androgen index. So that would probably be a best marker to diagnose hyperandrogenism in PCOS.
Yeah, so that is a message from this slide. You cannot use an ELISA to test the free testosterone level. We need to calculate the free androgen index or bioavailable testosterone by calculating, having the total testosterone and calculating your SHBG, and then you calculate, and then that's how we have to find out the free testosterone level. So Neeta, do you think this patient is at a risk of developing IGT and diabetes, and how do you check for it?
Most certainly there is a risk, because at the end of the day, although the insulin resistance in lean PCOS is less than that in an obese PCOS, the risk is still more than in a non-PCOS as compared to a lean PCOS. So she's definitely at an increased risk of developing IGT and diabetes. And the best thing to do would be look at all the actual markers that we do, that is regular fasting. The ideal thing would be do an OGTT, that is a modified OGTT, where you would do the WHO criteria of fasting and 2 hours post 75 grams glucose and an HbA1c. However, the caveat is that an HbA1c is not standardized throughout India. It is not done by the ideal method that it should be done in, and you get very skewed results, very erroneous results, and hence we would like to it is complementary, but we would definitely want to do an FPG and a PPG after 75 grams glucose. Especially if the patient is borderline, then you would want to actually give glucose. In general, in routine practice, we don't always give glucose and see, we just do a postprandial, a post-meal sugar. But ideally speaking, academically speaking, it has to be post-glucose. And the values that you have projected, they are the correct ones.
So do we screen them for insulin resistance? Do you want to screen these people, Dr. Vikrant? Do you want to screen these people for insulin resistance?
Definitely, no, ma'am. In clinical practice, screening for insulin resistance is really not needed, because the management strategy does not depend based upon the insulin resistance. In fact, the management of these patients depends upon the surrogate markers, like as we already discussed, to look for OGTT. Impaired OGTT would change the metformin, would change the management in terms of adding insulin sensitizers. But insulin resistance will not give us any clue or would not change the management in any way. And as it is, we know that most patients with PCOS will have some form of insulin resistance. Though clinically, we can assess for insulin resistance in the form of acanthosis nigricans or skin tags. Yeah, these are all the methods for measuring insulin resistance. The gold standard being the euglycemic clamp technique, which is done only in a research setting. There are much easier ways to measure insulin resistance as well, like this HOMA-IR, which can be done by just having a fasting blood glucose and a fasting insulin. And using the formula, you can get a HOMA-IR. That is very simple and practical way of assessing insulin resistance. There are other simpler ways of like assessing resistance, like fasting insulin, glucose, GIR, and a quickie. But the important thing here to note is that none of these are really validated. We do not have a cutoff value to define insulin resistance. Even if you take HOMA-IR for that instance, which is very easy to do in clinical practice, you do not have a cutoff, a definite cutoff where you can see beyond this is HOMA-IR and below this is insulin sensitive. So these are just tests which can be done on a research basis or in clinical studies, and they do not have any practicality in terms of patient management.
So in routine practices, these tests have not been validated. Okay. So do you recommend to start metformin in her? She's a lean PCOS. Do you want to start metformin in her? And if you want to start, what is the dose of metformin?
Yeah. Here, starting metformin in these lean PCOS, one thing we got to know is we have to screen them for metabolic parameters. You have to look for IGT or do a 75-gram OGTT. And if she falls into the category of IGT or impaired fasting glucose, then definitely she would be a candidate for metformin therapy. That is one definite indication in PCOS patients to start metformin therapy is if they have any evidence of impaired glucose tolerance or prediabetes. So in case we decide to start metformin, since these are very lean patients, we'd like to start with a very low dose of around 250 milligram to 500 milligram. And the maximum dose that we would give in these patients would be up to 850 milligram of metformin, rather than 2 grams of metformin that we give in obese patients. So this is one indication of metformin therapy, which is accepted by most of the guidelines, the Endocrine Society, the ACE, as well as the ESHRE. There are other uses of metformin, even in lean PCOS. Metformin has been shown to improve the menstrual regularity. It has been shown to decrease the hyperandrogenism. But again, these are off-label indications. It is up to the discretion of the physician or the gynecologist to start metformin or not to start metformin for clinical benefit in these cases.
So anovulatory infertility and metformin in lean PCOS, I think a lot of studies have come and we do say that metformin does help in lean PCOS with anovulatory infertility.
Exactly, ma'am. That is another indication where the ladies who are women who are planning fertility and who have anovulatory and they're planning for ovulation induction, metformin, background metformin would definitely improve the ovulation rates.
Okay. So is there a role of myo-inositol?
Again, myo-inositol is another insulin sensitizer which has been tried in PCOS patients. It has shown in a few clinical studies to decrease the insulin resistance, to decrease the androgenic markers, and also to clinically improve the cyclicity as well as hirsutism scores. But again, there are no large studies or long-term studies with this molecule. And as per most of the guidelines and to date, myo-inositol should still be considered as an experimental therapy in patients with PCOS.
So more studies are required.
More studies are needed, and maybe later on we'll have a clear idea whether really it is indicated. But at present, none of the guidelines, they recommend using myo-inositol as an insulin sensitizer in PCOS.
Though there are some studies which are strongly recommend, right? So, but then, yeah, I think especially in lean PCOS, I don't think there are many studies which are looking at myo-inositol and lean PCOS. We don't think we have many studies. Yeah.
Exactly.
So this is for Neeta. What is her risk of developing metabolic syndrome apart from type 2 diabetes? And do you want to screen all lean PCOS for metabolic syndrome? Neeta is there?
Yes, definitely. I would like to. Am I audible?
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
ma'am.
Yeah. As I said, they are all at the risk of developing metabolic syndrome on account of the insulin resistance, and they may have more visceral fat, which again puts them to become hepatic insensitive to insulin, and hence they all are potentially patients for developing type 2 diabetes. And therefore, it is definitely mandatory that every lean PCOS, even if they do not exhibit the signs of insulin resistance, they should be looked for it. We have to look for the type 2 diabetes and the IGT, IFG, and we don't know at what point they're going to become that, because their insulin reserves we don't know. So even if they are okay today, periodically they must be tested.
So they must be screened for metabolic syndrome.
For metabolic syndrome, because hyperinsulinemia doesn't only cause problems with the glucose metabolism. You have problems with hypertension. You have problems with the lipoprotein metabolism. And that is why you can have hypertriglyceridemia, which is again a component of the metabolic syndrome. So all these factors are there, the dyslipidemia, the hypertension, all of these factors are a result of the insulin resistance and ensuing hyperinsulinemia, and hence on a periodic basis they should be looked at for the metabolic syndrome, because ultimately it's not just diabetes we are worried about. We are worried about the cardiovascular risk. So metabolic syndrome basically is going to tell you about the cardiac risk. And hence they should be all screened for metabolic syndrome.
Okay. So what is the role of vitamin D in PCOS? Sheila, can you take this? So what's the role of vitamin D?
Yeah, there are some studies that have shown that low vitamin D levels have been seen in PCOS patients. So screening for vitamin D levels and of course supplementing as and when required is absolutely essential. Having said that, vitamin D, low vitamin D is prevalent even without PCOS. So universally when we are screening, looking for low vitamin D is necessary, especially in Indians, in the Indian population.
So you do vitamin D estimation in all PCOS?
Yeah.
Okay. So now we'll come to the diet. What is the specific diet modification recommended for this woman? This is for Ruby. Tell us, she's a lean PCOS. So what is the diet modification you would like to tell her?
When we are looking at lean cases, we are not looking at weight loss, but we don't know if this patient or any lean patient is having high visceral fat. So we have to consider the total body fat percent and visceral fat. And if that is high, we have to look at cutting down the total body fat percentage. Even if we are not worried about the weight, we have to put them on diet, which are not caloric restricted, but not caloric dense. We have to ensure that we cut down on all the saturated fats, trans fatty acids, and we have to ensure that they do not consume refined fats. Currently, there are no such specific diet as such for PCOS guidelines. It has to be customized based on the biochemical parameters and the clinical symptoms. And especially for a case like this, she's also hypothyroid, as I remember in this case. Now we will have to, surprisingly, though she's hypothyroid, she's still having a BMI 17. So luckily, we don't have to worry on her caloric restriction, but we do have to tell her that, certain goitrogens, which we generally recommend to be taken in restricted amounts, like the cabbage, all these cruciferous vegetables, cabbage, cauliflower, and all these things, they can take in the cooked form, but avoid in the raw form. There is no, clinical evidence of A class, but still we do recommend these patients to restrict the amount of soya. Now, these patients whom we recommend also to exercise, we are also going to look at, increasing the protein intake in their diet. And if you see this patient, she also has severe acne. So if I'm going to tell her to increase her consumption of class 1 protein, which comes from milk and milk products, I would definitely recommend her to switch over to lean milk and milk products. So low fat milk would be an ideal choice for her. And today, almond milk is available. Besides soy milk, you also get nut milk, camel milk. So there are other vegan milk products which are available to these patients. And we don't know whether she's a vegetarian or non-vegetarian. So based on that, we can recommend a high fiber and a high protein diet. These basic guidelines. Besides that, we will have to have some adjuncts, like we discussed about vitamin D supplementation earlier. We also know that vitamin D itself is an independent marker of depression. And such girls who are infertile at the age of 21 trying to, adjust to her family and having, amenorrhea and all these things, depression can be an underlying reason. And she may or may not be doing emotional eating, which we come to know only after we do a dietary assessment and a complete diet recall. So based on our food frequency questionnaire, we will understand what are the, places that she's going wrong in terms of, and cut down on those trans fats. If she's taking alcohol, we'll have to cut down on that and make her understand about what are the refined foods and unpolished or polished choices that she has to make. So it has to be a customized diet plan for this woman because she's lean.
Yeah, many a times, Ruby, what happens, see this patient had BMI 13 and they come and tell you, give something to increase her weight. So they are so thin and they're so small, so they will come and ask you, give something so that, for a patient, when she's so thin and small, like that. So they'll say, give something to increase my weight. So what do you advise them?
At least for these women who are very, very thin, they think that eating the fried chips and ghee and, fried foods will help them increase. They don't understand it's only going to give them calorie-dense foods, which are high in saturated fat and trans fat, and will only worsen the insulin resistance, and they'll get into the vicious cycle. So we have to educate them on lean protein intake. And at the same time, if they want to have a nice, body image is also a very big question for these very, very thin girls. So if they are recommended to start exercising, right, we will have to ensure them eating good carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates, including good amount of fiber pre-exercise and post-exercise a good amount of protein to, to fill the gap of, the protein and the breakdown of the muscles. So if they do this and exercise and not do too much of cardio and also involve weight training and resistance training, they will be able to achieve a desired weight gain for these girls. And
exercise becomes a very important part of treatment for these patients, right?
not only for weight loss, but also for weight gain.
Weight gain, strength training. So
Yes.
Sheila, can you tell us what is the role of exercise? What do you advise this woman? What type of exercise?
Yeah, for this patient, her cardio requirement will be minimal. So we do need some amount of cardio to ensure that her cardiorespiratory endurance is improved. So even short form, short duration, high intensity interval training can be attempted twice or thrice a week. Having said that, if you have to start high intensity interval training, the patient has to be relatively fit. So which means you don't start off HIIT for a patient who's completely unfit. So ease her into the exercise. Even starting with walking is more than sufficient, but for a shorter duration of time, ask her to improve her intensity, that is the speed of the walk or the incline of the walk, in order to increase intensity. But most importantly, strength training is very important. And the strength training schedule needs to be directed towards building muscle, which means that the number of repetitions need to be low, and the amount of weight that is lifted needs to be higher, and the number of sets need to be higher. Now, when this kind of a routine is given to women, most of them are under the misguided impression that they will become bulky, they'll become masculine, and they will, they'll become very muscular. Now, that's not necessarily the case. Yes, you do build muscle, but not to the extent where you look masculine or excessively all that can be tailored to the patient. But definitely increasing muscle mass becomes very important for a woman like this, because in her case it's a tightrope that we are walking, where we don't want her to, we need her to not necessarily gain weight, but we need her to build muscle in order to, the BMI will go up slightly when you build muscle. Yeah. You do also want her to lose the visceral fat. And that's what weight training or strength training also does. It also helps in the removal or the depletion of the visceral fat. So strength training is very important. Strength training every day can be recommended, provided the routine is such that she can, you need to stimulate the muscle once in only 48 hours, not sooner than that. So the routine has to be tailored in such a way. And HIIT at least twice a week, twice or thrice a week, once she gets a little fitter. Otherwise, even just cardio of about 15 to 20 minutes is more than sufficient. Flexibility, of course, to improve the stretching, to improve the flexibility of the muscles, which can be either yoga or just simple stretches.
So strength training is very, very important. And does bring down her visceral fat as well, right?
Yeah.
So I think we'll move on to the next case. Shweta, could you please present the case?
Yes, ma'am. Our second case, she's a 27-year-old woman with primary infertility, married for 3 years. She came with a complaint of amenorrhea since a year. Also gives history of weight gain since 2 years. She had attained menarche at age 11. Since then, she has irregular cycles and she only bleeds with progesterone. On examination, her BMI is 32.5, waist circumference 101 centimeter, Ferriman Galway score 6, no acne, but acanthosis nigricans was noted. On exam, her hormone evaluation, the thyroid profile was normal, FSH 6.4 and LH 6.9, prolactin was normal, bioavailable testosterone 1.27 nanomole per liter, free testosterone 0.05, DHEA is 500 microgram per ml, AMH was 6.47. Her blood pressure was 150 by 90 mmHg, fasting was 130 and PPBS 220 milligram, triglycerides 180 milligram per deciliter, HDL 36 and LDL 110 milligram per deciliter. On transvaginal examination, her uterus was normal with the right ovarian volume of 12.5 and AFC 29, and the left ovarian volume of 10.9 with the AFC of 12. Hystosalpingography and male evaluation was normal.
Okay, so this question is for Dr. Rajshekhar. Does this lady fit into the definition of metabolic syndrome?
Yeah, sure. She satisfies the criteria for metabolic syndrome. She's got obesity, high blood pressure for her age, and she's got high levels of triglycerides. So I think she is a case of metabolic. She's got high blood sugar as well. So she's definitely metabolic syndrome, and she's a very high risk for any problems of metabolic syndrome in terms of cardiovascular risks as well, in addition to her polycystic ovaries.
So she fits into the classical case of a metabolic syndrome, right? So
Right.
these are all the factors. Would you like to elaborate on these?
Yeah, metabolic syndrome is a condition which is just pre-morbid obesity, and it kind of predisposes patients to a high risk of complications, both cardiovascular and otherwise. And it is important to identify these people when they are young and intervene early so that they don't get into serious complications. And this is one of the reasons which is uniquely seen in Asians. And therefore, initially we discussed the low BMI for Asians. And this is one of the reasons why the BMI points were reduced for Asians. And the comorbidities and the problems seen in the Asians were at a much lower BMI. And this is exactly the reason. You would see people in the Asian population with a much lower BMI with all these factors. And more than the BMI, these are the factors that cause harm to the patient. So very important to identify these early. And especially in these kind of patients, it is known that they have a very high risk of cardiovascular and a stroke incidence in their 4th and 5th decade. So it's important that these young girls, young patients are identified and they're make interventions early so that they don't develop a stroke early in their life.
Yeah. So it is very important we identify this metabolic syndrome. So what do we mean by lifestyle change? This is one of the commonly used terminology when we talk about PCOS. The lifestyle change is one of the first things we must tell them. Sheila, can you just tell us like what exactly you mean by lifestyle changes?
So, Shobna, lifestyle just means the daily habits that a patient inculcates into her life. So this could include her exercise, what she eats, how much she sleeps, what are her stress levels and what does she do to manage her stress levels? What are her social relationships and social connectedness? What is that all about? So it is what her life experience basically on a day-to-day basis. So her diet is extremely important. Ruby has expanded on that. Exercise is extremely important, whether she's lean or she's obese. Just the way she exercises or the amount of exercise will vary, but exercise is mandatory. Sleep is extremely important. I think we know that sleep is disrupted in PCOS patients, and disruption of sleep itself can lead to high stress levels, can predispose to everything from depression to diabetes to cardiovascular disease. So sleep becomes very important. Sleep hygiene needs to be practiced, where they try and go to sleep at the same time every night, avoid watching the screen, blue light for at least 2 hours prior to sleep, eat at least 3 hours prior to sleep, have a warm bath 2 hours prior to sleep, cool room, silent room, use the bedroom only for sleeping. These are all just small sleep hacks that they can practice. Stress management in terms of at the time of a stressor, what do they do? And then what do they do to mitigate stress as a separate practice? For instance, meditation on a regular basis can help them mitigate stress, lower their stress hormones. And at the time of stress, what can you do? Certain breathing patterns, etc., to lower the stress levels. So all these things need to be taught to the patient for her to implement it on a regular basis. So it has to become a part of her life, basically. That's what it means when lifestyle.
It is not only a diet and exercise, overall holistically how her lifestyle is and which all the areas where you can target it. That is what we are looking at. Okay, so we all know that we are what we eat. And I think in social media, there are so many, diets which are given for PCOS, and they say PCOS diet, and you eat this and your PCOS is cured. And so I want to know from Ruby, is there something called as a PCOS diet?
Well, as I said earlier, ma'am, PCOS diet has to be customized depending on the patient's lifestyle, patient, depending upon her biochemical parameters. But as you rightly said, there's a lot of information floating. So you may see patients either, surfing the net and either following a ketogenic diet or following an intermittent fasting or following Mediterranean diet. So most of the diet actually are based on the macronutrient composition, which is the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So either it will be high in proteins, high protein diets or Atkins diet, either it will be a low carbohydrate diet, okay, or it would be a low fat diet or a zero carb diet or different diets. Now, what is very important is if me as a clinician have to, give her a PCOS diet, it will not only be macronutrient focused, it will also be focused on the micronutrient composition. Because micronutrients like zinc, selenium, other antioxidants, other phytoestrogens play a very important role when we talk of supplementation also. So typically, if you look at our diet, which may be very suitable, would be a Mediterranean diet, which actually talks about taking a lot of good healthy fats, taking a lot of vegetables, not taking too much of carbohydrates. So that kind of a diet would be more or less realistic, practical, and combining everything. And when you talk of the time when they eat, so we are actually combining these things with intermittent fasting pattern. Put together, I think a portion control, okay, with a timely eating pattern would be an ideal PCO diet. Typically, it will be low in terms of fats, as I said, trans and saturated fats, and high in protein. So especially for vegan patients and for the earlier case also, if I have to suggest, I may also include seeds and dry fruits and nuts. That will increase the protein content. And if the patient has severe acne or high fat percentage, the dairy or the milk products may be a little less, or maybe high in probiotic rich, so that her gut is also taken care of. So based on that, and this patient also has a blood pressure above 150 and 90. So I'm going to give her a salt restricted diet very particularly for this kind of a patient. We have to take care of blood pressure also, and she is having high postprandial blood glucose level. So including good amount of fiber pre-meals or including a fiber supplement may help this patient. And definitely a carb counting should be done in this kind of a patient, where we are told how much to take when. So this will be a typical diabetes kind of a diet plan, which we would do this for this patient.
So you need to customize the diet for every patient, like depending upon all the factors, whatever you mentioned now.
Yes, yeah. And like she's 3-year-old married, and she's living in a family. So how much can we make only for her or for the entire family? So it has to be definitely a tailor-made diet plan.
Okay. Now, Sheila, could you tell us, what is the physical activity guidelines? This patient, we discussed about the lean PCOS. Now she's in obese PCOS. What should be the physical activity guidelines? And as you all know, like in our advice for any patient when they come to our practice is probably it's very rudimentary, because the moment we tell them, okay, diet, this is all we need to do, then you must do exercise. We nod our head, they nod their head, and they go. Finish. They'll come back again. Everything will remain same. So I think what is important for us to understand is, if you say exercise to them, and when you tell them exercise, they will say they are exercising. If you ask them what they are doing, they will say we go for a walk. There ends our conversation. So, how do we address this issue? I want you to walk through your treatment or what your protocol, what you do for a patient when you talk about physical activity.
Okay. So for this patient, the primary concern would be weight loss. So cardio becomes important 6 days a week. That would be the frequency. When you write a prescription for exercise, it has to be a prescription just like you would write for antibiotics. So you have to include frequency, duration, and intensity. So for cardio, the frequency would be 6 days a week. The duration, that is the time that she walks, would be approximately 45 minutes. It does not have to be a continuous 45 minutes because, especially if they're very obese, they may not find it comfortable to walk for 45 minutes. So she can even start with 3 doses of 15 minutes and then become 30 minutes twice a day. That's fine. So, but work towards 45 minutes a day for 6 days a week. And the intensity, because she's obese, she needs to start at a lower intensity, because again, discomfort can put them off exercise altogether. So just ask her to walk at an intensity where she's still comfortable. So we usually use what is called as the talk test to assess intensity. So that means that if a patient is, on a scale of 1 to 10, if she is completely comfortable, as we are all sitting here and talking to each other, you're probably at around 2, intensity of about 2. If you move around the house, you're still comfortable talking to each other, that's around 5. When you start to breathe a little harder and you find it difficult, you can exchange about a sentence or so with the person next to you, that's about 6. And 7 is when you can exchange not more than a sentence with a person, and over and above that is where you can barely say a couple of words. So that's about 7 to 8. So 8 to 9. So you ask her to walk at a comfortable pace where she is at around 50 or 5% or 5 on a scale of 1 to 10. Then gradually increase the intensity. Another way to do this is to now there are devices available. So have her wear one of those Fitbits and start her from, on average, most people move around 3,000 steps a day. So we need to ask her to increase the number of steps, starting to about 5,000, then 8,000, and at least 10 to 15,000 in a day. So that's as far as cardio goes. Now, she also requires strength training, minimum twice a week, preferably about thrice or 4 times a week, addressing all body parts. So if she can address 2 days of lower body and 2 days of upper body, that would be ideal. She would need not more than 3 sets per exercise, about 12 repetitions, as opposed to the lean woman who has many more sets, lower reps, and a higher weight. So the weight she uses should allow her to complete 12 repetitions, 10 to 12 repetitions per set. So that would be her weight training. She also needs flexibility. So yoga is ideal because it brings into play her breathing, so that gives her that whole sense of mindfulness, and it also improves flexibility. Own body weight exercises are okay, but in this particular person, I would start with strength training using external weights, because her own body weight is really too much. So she starts with external weights, and then she can move on to own body weights if she prefers. And as far as cardio goes, while I've said walking, I usually tell the patient to do something that she really enjoys, because that's the thing that she will be able to sustain. So it could be a dance class, it could be a Zumba class. There are a whole variety of exercises, classes that are available. But before she does that, I would recommend that she learns the form of the exercise properly, because injury is high when you're in a class situation, when you're trying to follow an instructor who's probably doing it really well and you're trying to emulate her. So form of exercise becomes very important. So I usually recommend walking to begin with. As they get fitter and as they start increasing in their intensity and get stronger, then they can join classes and do what they enjoy. But certainly include strength training, include flexibility as a part of their fitness.
So you mean to say that it's not enough if they just do a cardio, it's not enough if they do only strength training, or if they do only yoga? You mean to say they should have a combination of all these things when you're talking about weight reduction in this patient, this particular type of patients?
Yes, in this particular patient, yes, you do need all 3, because I would imagine that she's not really fit. You see, the fitter you get, you can incorporate your cardio, your strength, and your flexibility into 1 hour. You can do that because you're fit and you know how to manipulate the exercises, manipulate the strength training exercises to get your cardio in and do a quick stretch. But when a patient is not fit and when she's starting out, you have to lay a very strong foundation. So she needs her cardio, strength training, and flexibility to be done separately. So she learns the exercises properly, gets comfortable, does not injure herself, and also loses weight at the same time.
So this is one piece of information which I got it from ASHRAE guidelines, and I thought it's very good for all of us to put it in our consultation. And they have given very clearly here, what's light, what is moderate, and what is vigorous exercise. And also weight maintenance, like how much activity is ideal? I think this is a question which we need to understand. How much activity is ideal? So this activity depends upon the weight maintenance. Suppose a person wants to just maintain the weight, it's a different thing. Suppose they want to lose weight, then it's a different thing. And for adolescent, it is different. So it is very important that we don't give an uniform on general rule for all of them. You do this. Suppose you just want to maintain, probably that's a recommendation they give. And if the patient is very obese, if you just want telling her that do take some diet and exercise, probably we need to move on to the next level of intervention. What do you say, Sheila?
Yeah, absolutely. The WHO just recommends 150 minutes in a week. I don't think that's sufficient at all. Especially in our Indian scenario, I don't think that's sufficient at all. I think we do need to exercise at least an hour every single day, which means about 6 hours in a week. So, like you said, 150 minutes is just weight maintenance, and you do need more than that if you need to lose weight.
And many of the patients are very comfortable telling us, like, she does all the household work. She's very active. She does all the household work. Or I really do not know how many of Indian women do that muscle strengthening exercise. I think this is one area. I think the majority of Indian women don't do that muscle strengthening exercise. And I think it becomes very important that we tell them that is important, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Shobna. Strength training is very important, and it so happens that we have a whole lot of gadgets these days, like your your washing machine and your vacuum cleaner. You're not really physically active, and we are sitting a lot of the time. Even if she's a housewife, she doesn't really do much physical work in the house. She could, if she wants to, and she wants to implement and increase her activity, she could, and one can encourage her to do that. But ideally we don't, which is the reason why we have to do something quite artificial, like going to a gym and pulling and pushing weights. Unfortunately, we have to do that.
Okay. How much weight loss do you target in your patients? How much weight loss? How do you say, like, okay, now she's doing well, she's not doing well, she needs to go to pharmacotherapy or bariatric surgery? How do you decide?
See, what happens is an obese patient, usually they start, and I think Dr. Rajshekar also can, tell me if this is true. Well, the obese patient usually tends to start losing weight quickly and then plateaus. If the more weight you have to lose, once you implement the exercise and the diet, and if they are consistent with it, you do tend to lose weight quite quickly, and then you tend to plateau. And that's the time she requires the motivation and the encouragement and the right kind of guidance to sustain the exercise and the diet. Ideally, about 0.5 to 1 kilo in a week is more than sufficient. But like I said, the initial couple of months, she may drop quite a bit, even 5 to 6 kilos, that 5 to 6 kilos in the first, say, about 3 months. And then the plateau starts to happen. So that's when you need to monitor them. How do we follow up? They do need very regular follow-up, preferably even on a weekly basis. Because even if there is no weight loss on a weekly basis, just encouraging them, talking to them about their diet, reviewing their diet recall, encouraging them to walk a little more or do a little more of housework, or non-exercise, not really exercise, but activity, that really helps to keep them motivated. Because this is a psychological thing, really, isn't it?
Does this patient need pharmacological treatment for obesity? Neeta, do you think that she needs, okay, let's say that she's already doing, she has started along with the diet and then exercise, but then her weight remains same. Do you think that she needs pharmacological treatment for obesity?
Yeah, Shobna, I'll answer this question in 2 parts.
Okay.
The first part is pertaining to this particular patient, where she is already diabetic, she is obese, and GLP-1 receptor agonists are certified or licensed for use for such patients.
Okay.
And she definitely will benefit from it. Even straight after metformin, this drug can be used, and she's going to benefit from it. And we don't even have to look at the BMI or any cutoffs when we're using liraglutide or any GLP-1 receptor agonist in such a patient, because she's already diabetic. So there's no question. The second part I would like to answer, if this patient was not diabetic and was only obese, what would you do?
Yeah.
Well, pharmacotherapy is required. Guidelines are there. You have cutoff points. You have cutoff points which tell you that 32 or 37, 37 and above you give pharmacotherapy. 32 with comorbidities you give pharmacotherapy. So all these guidelines are there. But ultimately, this has to be customized. At the end of the day, guidelines are only guidelines. It also, you have to look at the motivation of the patient. You have to look at whether the patient is psychologically okay or not, very depressed about weight. In those conditions, when you want to kickstart weight loss a little faster, you might have to use pharmacotherapy even at lower levels of BMI. There is no harm. So the cutoff points are there: 32 with comorbidities, 37 without comorbidities, at which you actually start at this pharma. No, actually those are for surgery. Yeah, there are lower level
pharmacotherapy. Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. You have lower levels for pharmacotherapy of BMI. But having said that, as I said, it has to be ultimately customized. So whether it is at 27 or 28 or so, these are all numbers. So they are good guidelines, but pharmacotherapy can be used even right from the beginning along with diet and exercise for the simple reason of adherence to diet and exercise and long-term. It has been shown in studies that long-term adherence and long-term effectivity of diet and exercise is augmented best by pharmacotherapy, given even in the beginning in tandem with it.
Okay. So these are the medications. I think you did answer that. What are the medications were approved for obesity?
Well, in India, unfortunately, for a non-diabetic only obesity, only Orlistat, which is a lipase inhibitor, has been licensed for use. In the West, liraglutide is being used up to 3 milligrams for obese patients who are non-diabetic, or solely for the use of obesity. In India, it is not yet licensed for use for pure and simple obesity, but off-label, a lot of people use it, even at pre-diabetic level, even at non-diabetic level, and the results are there because it is licensed elsewhere. And now, to give you the information, the newest drug, which has given even better results than liraglutide, is semaglutide. And until this time, liraglutide and semaglutide are injectable. But oral semaglutide is in the pipeline, and that is going to be a game changer if it gets approved for obesity because it's oral. So that is the other thing. But as of now, if you ask, only Orlistat is there. But the results with Orlistat are not really great. You get about 2 to 3 kgs weight loss at the end of 6 months, which is really not very encouraging. And we don't have very high fat diets to use lipase inhibitors. So Orlistat really doesn't help our population to that extent. And as such, if you ask me, on label, we really don't have anything.
Yeah, that's an important point. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you recommend any herbal preparations or any Ayurvedic medicines to anybody?
Well, who's taking this question?
Anyone of you.
Yeah, I personally don't, because a lot of these herbal and Ayurvedic preparations have got certain toxic substances. They talk about Garcinia cambogia, then they talk that there are hydroxycitrate. There are so many ingredients in all of these which could be toxic, and there is no monitor. These are not monitored. Liver function is not monitored. Kidney function is not monitored. So you don't really know what is happening. They may be available off the counter. People buy it off Amazon.
Okay.
And then nobody, yes. So you don't know who is monitoring them. And these things don't require a license for use.
Yeah.
Liraglutide is licensed for use elsewhere, but not yet licensed in India.
Yeah.
So these drugs which have stood the test of time have undergone phase 3 clinical trials. They are not licensed. But these kind of things can be licensed, and we don't, I'm not saying they're bad, but we don't know.
You don't know.
What we don't know, I don't think we should be using.
Yeah. Okay. So now we'll move on to Dr. Rajshekhar. What are the indications for bariatric surgery? And what are the, tell us about the, briefly, if you can tell us, what are the benefits and risks associated with it?
In this patient particularly, what we need to look at is why did she come to us? First of all, she has come for infertility. So her main problem is infertility and not weight loss. And we have identified she's got problems. She's got metabolic syndrome and bordering on indication for bariatric surgery. So the most important thing is in these kind of patients to try to get them to lose weight, because sometimes we know that even 5 to 7% of weight loss is good enough for her to become pregnant. So that is something which we have to keep very, very foremost in our minds. And as far as bariatric surgery is concerned, there are guidelines, and the standard guidelines are 37.5 without comorbidities and 32.5 with comorbidities. These are very standard guidelines. But then in selected patients, you can do outside these guidelines, and with hope, knowing well that the patient understands the risks and benefits of surgery. And it is very difficult to convince a patient who's come for infertility to undergo bariatric surgery, because they don't understand the connection between the two. And the common perception is bariatric surgery is very cosmetic, which it is not.
Yeah.
So if this patient has failed in spite of several rounds of medically supervised weight loss and exercise lifestyle programs, and then I would be able to offer her bariatric surgery. I would clearly tell her that it is a major operation with a permanent change in her lifestyle, and there are short-term and long-term risks involved with the procedure. The short-terms are perioperative complications, and the long-term could be nutritional deficiencies. But I would also tell her that she has a very good chance of weight loss and reversal of her comorbidities, particularly diabetes, which can affect her. When she becomes pregnant, she'll definitely become a GDM. So that's an advantage for her, that her diabetes resolution will happen. She must also wait for at least 12 to 18 months after the bariatric surgery. She can't rush in and try for pregnancy immediately. So it's not good for her to become pregnant within 6 months, which can happen sometimes. As soon as the patient loses about 7-8%, they can become pregnant. So these are some of the things that I would warn them. And we have published our own experience in the Indian Journal of Surgery, where we have looked at one of the few papers which looks at the pregnancy outcomes after bariatric surgery. And we have divided the patients into polycystic and non-polycystic patients. And it is interesting to see the spontaneous conception rates are pretty high, up to 67%, and the resolution of comorbidities. So I would advise people who are listening to this to have a look at the paper. It's based on an Indian study and on our own patients. So there are some interesting things that we looked at there. We looked at insulin levels, we looked at OGTT, we have looked at the AMH levels, and then we have looked at weight loss and a few other factors which have direct influence on the patient's resolution of comorbidities. So of course, I would offer this girl bariatric surgery, but that would be the last option if she has failed miserably with other options.
So I think we must offer them. Probably if we don't offer them, they will not know at all. And as you said very rightly, if they come for infertility, the conversion rate may be less because they have come for infertility. But then I think it is important for a gynecologist to understand that if the woman's BMI is more than 40 or something like that, if you go on giving a diet and exercise and only they get stuck there, probably maybe we are not doing justice to the treatment, the facilities that are available. So I think we offer them, and then she can take a decision whether she would want to go for it or she doesn't want to go for it. What do you say?
Yeah, I mean, the patient has to decide, obviously, and we need to tell them about the short-term and long-term influences of bariatric surgery, because we don't want this patient to go into depression because she can't eat as much as she wanted to previously. And there are instances of patients going into depression. She's a very young girl, so we have to be very careful and tell her that it's meant to be irreversible, a bariatric procedure, although in certain procedures we can reverse it, but it's meant to be irreversible and it's a permanent lifestyle change. And there are certain requirements that, they can't binge drink. There are a whole lot of things that they have to be very careful about in their... Yeah, they have to be very aware of all these things. And it is not a short-term thing that you do and send the patient home. That there can be nutritional deficiencies. I've seen patients coming back with very severe B12 deficiencies. So it's very important that the patients understand all these things before we just go and do the surgery.
Okay. So after careful counseling, then we can take a call and...
I spend several hours talking to them, and I go to a point where they come and ask for it rather than me telling them you need this surgery.
But doing so, don't you think we'll bereft some of the patients who really need it? There's some patients, don't you think they really need it? And then, we have to be a little more open for it.
No, we have to tell them.
I have a couple of patients, Rajshekhar, they are very happy. I mean, they are very good. And as you said rightly, they have lost 45, 50 kgs. I don't think any exercise, any diet, and, we could have we can talk about bringing down a weight like that?
Yeah, the thing is that once they have touched morbid obese levels, when they cross 37.5,
Yeah.
probably 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 2 in 1,000 will be able to lose sufficient amount of weight and maintain that weight loss. There are people who have lost. I've seen people who have lost 20, 22 kilos, 25 kilos, but it just takes them 6 or 8 months to put it back on.
Yeah.
And when they put back on the weight, it's just the fat and the lean body mass doesn't come back.
Yeah.
So that is, and every time, every cycle, they become more and more unhealthy and they end up having diabetes and hypertension and a whole lot of problems. So yeah. So it's very important that you must tell them that this weight loss surgery is a very good tool. Again, there are a lot of restrictions. It's like a good smartphone. If you use it properly, it will last a very long time. If you don't use it properly, it will just become junk. So it's a very important tool in their hands. And it's not that you do the surgery and tell them, okay, you lost weight, now you're doing very well. Important to tell them that it's also requires a lot of lifestyle changes.
Yeah. So Ruby, are you into giving this intermittent fasting for weight loss? You're happy about the results?
Honestly, ma'am, it helps a lot of people.
Helps a lot?
It really helps a lot of people because for some
Any
people,
Indian studies are there on comparing the routine diet and versus intermittent fasting in PCOS?
So yes, we do have short-term studies. We still are waiting for long-term studies to see the long-term impact on these intermittent fasting. Even Dr. Neeta would agree that yes, intermittent fasting controls. It helps in doing a portion control. It restricts the number of times a day. The only tool that we need to keep in mind is that tell them what to eat during this interval period.
Exactly.
They can eat anything and everything and any amount that they want. So if you guide them under good guidance, if they are, then definitely intermittent fasting, because we also have seen the reversal of the diabetes. We've seen, the reversal of the beta cell function back in, they're functioning once again. So I think it's a very good way of weight loss. Of course, we are not competing with bariatric surgery, but for those who cannot control what they're eating, intermittent fasting works really.
Yeah, and one other thing I would like to add here, Shobna, about intermittent fasting is that the way it is supposed to act is by reducing insulin levels. Because when you fast for so long, your insulin levels go down. And in these kind of patients of PCOS, that is even more relevant to us. So though there are no studies particularly in PCOS, but the pathogenesis, the way it works, it's worth exploring.
Yeah.
I think one of the important things that we, before and after bariatric surgery, we tell the patients very clearly about the insulin spike, although to an extent they may not understand. What we tell them in simple terms is, you prevent an insulin spike and that is going to push fat into your cells. That is even before and after surgery. Yes. There are patients who regain weight after bariatric surgery and they come for sometimes asking revision surgery. And all you need to do is ask them to have, less of carbs, particularly those that spike the insulin. Now we know that insulin spike is the one that causes all the damage, whether it is the fatty liver or the visceral fat. So it's important that you tell them that you have avoid this insulin spike at any cost. So I know it's difficult in India because we have festivals and a whole lot of things happening, and people force you to have a little bit of sweet here and there. But it's important to convince these patients about this part of the metabolism.
That's why the intermittent fasting really helps in this situation, because that full period of fasting at least brings down the insulin levels to that extent.
Okay, thank you. So I think this Dr. Sheila has already covered, and she'd say that how the stress and sleep management is very important, and also she told about holistically how you need to treat the patient, like about the behavioral therapy. And this is again one of the very important thing to get rid of that old habit what we have, and it is all wired with us, what we have been doing for so many years. Not at all easy to get rid of any habit for that matter, we know, and that motivation may not be good enough, to continue for long. I think this is another very important area where we should definitely target the patients. Is there any connection between the gut microbiome and PCOS, Ruby?
Yes, this is very pertinent and relevant because we're talking about insulin resistance, and we know when there is a gut dysbiosis, when there's a leaky gut and there is an endotoxemia in the body, there is an inflammatory bone, and we know that these are directly correlated to the metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. And studies have shown that if you introduce probiotics and if you change the type of gut flora in the body of a patient, you see reversal of diabetes, you see the improved fertility also. There are a lot of studies which have proven that. especially increasing the amount of, by providing fiber. We are also giving prebiotics along with the probiotics. So that increases the short chain fatty acids, and that tightens the, intestinal barrier. So yes, there is a connection. There's no doubt about it.
This is one of the very hot research topic, I think. A lot of papers are coming up on gut microbiome and PCOS. Yeah. So can you quickly tell us what are these ergogenic aids and what is the seed cycling? These are the fad words that are being used.
Yeah. So ergogenic aids, like I'm also mentioned the herbal supplements and other things. So ergogenic aids are adjuncts, like taking black coffee, take Garcinia cambogia. These are the things which they take to hasten the weight loss process. There is no scientific evidence on this whatsoever. There may be, that increases the BMR, it reduces helps in reduction of fat percentage, increases the metabolic rate. Yet agreed, but there is no scientific evidence of taking any of these products. They may only be psychologically having an impact that yes, we are taking fat burners, so it may help. Going quickly to seed cycling, this is a very, very new concept. Again, whatsoever, there's no scientific evidence. Taking different types of seeds, for example, the flax seeds, have been recently studied. Says those studies. So what they do is they divide the seed cycling into two phases. So in first phase, where immediately that's called the moon phase. So immediately the patient is advised to take 1 tablespoon of pumpkin seeds and flax seeds. They assume that the zinc content of this may help in the release of certain hormones, estrogen. And the other cycle, after your periods, it is a second luteal phase. The patients are told to take sunflower seeds and sesame seeds. It's basically the micronutrient composition, which will actually help. So there may have a better PMS. They may have, better psychological impact. They assume that it will have an impact on the hormonal balance. It is too early to say whether this works or not, but there is no harm in taking these micronutrients in terms of seeds, whether you take it all together or whether you take it in cycles. So far, honestly, I have not tried this on any patient, but this very recent concept which is growing soon, and patients are trying on their own, taking seeds at different times.
Yeah, people do come and ask you, what is this? Like, whether we can do this. Yeah.
It's worth trying, I must say.
Yeah.
Definitely, it's worth trying and doing some, study on this.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we'll move on to the next round of questions. This is going to be a rapid fire questions to each one of you. And first we'll start with Ruby. And I think it's just one word answer. We don't want explanation. Just we want you to say this or that. That's it. Okay. So for Ruby, the first question is poha or cornflakes for breakfast?
Brown poha with vegetables and nuts.
Okay. Fruit juice or fruits?
Whole fruits.
Whole fruits. Roti, chapati or rice?
Roti and chapati are one and the same. So either roti or chapati or brown rice. So all three can be taken.
So all are okay.
All are okay.
The portion control?
Yes, portion control. Yes, you got it.
Okay. Early dinner versus late dinner?
Early dinner.
Early dinner. Makes a huge difference?
Yes, ma'am. Because not very early also, because then people start munching at bedtime. Yeah. So not very early dinner, but not at the bedtime.
Okay. Sugar, jaggery or honey or none?
None.
None. Honey also no?
No. Definitely no.
Okay.
All simple carbs.
Whatever the dietitian say, we must agree, yes. Whole egg or only egg white?
Whole egg.
Cow's milk or buffalo's milk or mixed?
Preferably cow's milk or low-fat milk.
Cow's milk or low? Okay. Okay. So Ruby has answered very well for these questions. Now we'll move on to Vikrant. Vikrant, lean PCOS or obese PCOS? What is your choice of patient?
And definitely lean PCOS, ma'am.
Is it? So
Yeah.
I thought maybe lean PCOS are difficult to manage, no? You don't think so?
And they have less insulin resistance, so it's very easy to manage, less hyperandrogenism, very easy to treat, ma'am. Less insulin resistance as well.
Okay. So waist circumference or WH ratio? Waist hip ratio?
Waist circumference, ma'am.
Waist circumference, practically you think waist circumference is okay?
Yeah, it is easier to do in a clinical setting. Hip ratios would be difficult to take by the nursing assistants. Plus, certain ethnicities may have, some people may have higher broad hips where it will lead to a falsely low waist hip ratio. So waist circumference would be ideal.
Okay. So I think we answered this. Sensitive test for biochemical hyperandrogenism, total testosterone or free testosterone at DHEAS. I think
Free testosterone would be ideal one.
statins for hyperandrogenemia.
No, ma'am.
No.
Statins, though they decrease hyperandrogenemia, they're not approved yet. They can be used for other indications.
Statins are not given only for hyperandrogenemia. Spironolactone or flutamide?
Definitely spironolactone, ma'am.
Spironolactone.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So we'll move to Neeta. Neeta, morbid obesity. Bariatric physician or bariatric surgeon?
The services of both will be required.
So start with physician and then move to bariatric surgeon?
Yes, and then come back to physician.
You're a very smart physician. Okay. Orlistat or liraglutide?
Liraglutide.
Food rich in micronutrients or dietary supplements?
Food rich in micronutrients.
Very good. Curds or probiotic capsules?
Curds.
They do as good as probiotics?
They may not be, but you don't require that much amount of probiotics. So if you have, it can come through other things also.
So legumes or protein powder?
Protein powder.
So you're very strong about it.
I'm very strong about it because legumes, they have a lot of carbs, and if somebody is on a weight reducing diet and you want to supplement proteins and you want it all to come from legumes, then the calorie count goes very high.
Oh, okay.
That is the reason I would say protein powder.
Okay, point well taken. The worst myth you heard about diabetes?
The worst myth about diabetes today is that diabetes, once you get, is lifelong and incurable and cannot go into remission. We have patients, we do a lot of work on reversal of diabetes. So that's the worst myth about diabetes.
Oh, that's really very, very encouraging
Yes.
statement you have made. Anita. I think very encouraging. All the diabetics who are listening to this webinar.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
they
And
must understand.
I would like to add here, Shobna, that it is not only the new diabetics, even diabetics more than 10 years we have reversed.
Oh, that's really
Yes.
good. That's really good. Okay, now we'll move to Sheila. Sheila, diet or exercise? Which is more important?
Both.
One if you have to choose?
For weight loss, diet is more important.
Lifestyle, you would say exercise.
No, diet is more important if you're looking at weight loss.
So diet is more important, right?
Yeah, weight loss.
Drinking green tea reduces weight.
Only if you walk up the hill to pick the leaves, Shobna.
That is a good one. That is a very good one.
By itself.
Is grazer better than a binger?
Neither.
Neither. Oh. Okay.
Yeah, like Neeta said, insulin keeps spiking if you graze. I wouldn't encourage that. And binging certainly isn't a good idea.
Okay.
Aerobic exercise and yoga and Pilates and strength training.
Yeah. See, this is one definitely very strong message which Sheila has given. It is not one, it's everything. Aerobic exercise, yoga, Pilates and strength training. Yeah. NEAT or gym?
Both. Activity is as important as exercise. So just because you exercise for an hour doesn't mean you can sit around for the rest of the day. You need
Okay. Meditation or therapist?
both.
Both? You're giving them the luxury of everything here, Sheila.
I think some people do need a therapist also, although
I think so, which is one thing, like, mood disorders in PCO is something which has been really not really understood and not well addressed. I think that's one of the things which I think we all have to understand. I think, yeah. Rajshekhar, morbid obesity. She should come to you or to Neeta?
Surgeon.
Surgeon. So
Yeah.
there's no two thoughts about it.
No, they would have done all that before they come. Because morbid obesity, like I said, the chance of losing and sustaining weight loss is proven 3 decades ago. So, but definitely the physician is a very important part of the team, both before and after surgery.
Okay. So sleeve gastrectomy or Roux-en-Y?
My personal preference is sleeve unless there are some contraindications for sleeve like bad reflux or, patients have got insulin dependent diabetes. Then I would probably favor bypass.
What's a common myth about bariatric surgery?
People think there are a lot of side effects. People think that it can make you very unwell after surgery. and which is not true, because they have seen patients who have not been followed up very well, or the patient's compliances are bad, then you have patients going around with a lot of nutritional problems. Otherwise, there's no problems.
Okay. Biggest challenge for a bariatric surgeon?
You have to convince the patient of the benefits when they actually need the surgery. Very, very difficult to convince.
Yeah. So bariatric surgery should be avoided in a woman who's planning pregnancy in near future. True or false?
12 months. 12 months only.
How many months?
12 months.
12 months. Okay.
Yeah, 12 months, and then see the obstetrician, see the nutritionist, correct their nutritional problems, and then go for pregnancy.
Yeah. So I think we are finished with the rapid fire round, and I think a lot of information we could get it this rapid fire, and I think you have done a wonderful job. So I think that's the end of our discussion, and I think I just wanted to present this article to all the people who are watching. This is an article which was published in 2018 on lean polycystic ovarian syndrome, an evidence-based practical approach. And it's one of the very nice article, and they have also given a management algorithm for the management of lean PCOS. You can take a picture of this. So whatever we have discussed so far, everything has been given in an oligo form. Okay, now so we have come to the end of our discussion. So the take-home message, this is a combined effort of all the panelists who felt that this is what should be the take-home message. Lean PCOS form a small but significant proportion of PCOS patients. Insulin resistance is inherent in PCOS, independent of obesity. Altered hormonal, metabolic, and hematological profile in lean women are comparable to that of an obese PCOS. Normal weight but central obesity women have significantly higher incidence of metabolic syndrome. So when you need to combine BMI with measurement of central obesity, which provides better metabolic risk factor stratification than taking only BMI. All morbid obesity patients must be offered bariatric surgery with extensive counseling, as already been discussed. Exercise, diet, and lifestyle changes is as important for lean PCOS as the obese PCOS. Only the mode of exercise or the diet what we give may vary. And treat the person holistically, not just the symptom or the disease. So I think I thank everyone for the patient hearing. Now I think we'll move on to the question and answer session. I hope to see some questions in the chat box. Oh, quite a lot of questions in the chat box. So I think maybe few questions we can take up which are not covered in our discussion. So one of the question is lifestyle management of lean PCOS. I think we already touched upon it. Cutoff for fasting in serum insulin levels. Is there anything called as a cutoff for fasting serum level?
Yeah, ma'am. Some studies that take up to fasting level more than 25 as insulin resistant, but a more accurate way is to take the HOMA-IR values. More than 2 they consider as mild insulin resistance. More than 4 they consider as severe insulin resistance. So HOMA-IR less than 2 is considered to be normal.
So can we combine when to start patients on metformin? I think you very clearly are told that metformin can be given to the patient who has got an IGT or diabetes and lean PCOS we are talking about, and also in the patient who has got anovulatory infertility, metformin helps. That's what you told us. And can we combine myo-inositol and dipyro-inositol combination in insulin resistance? Can we combine this? Can we combine myo-inositol along with metformin? Do you think that there is any logic in combining metformin myo-inositol?
No, ma'am. Metformin in as itself is a very good insulin sensitizer. It has been there for almost 5 decades, and it is a time-tested drug, both in terms of cardiac safety as well as in terms of other safety parameters. Myo-inositol is a relatively newer drug, and again, it is an insulin sensitizer. We do not have enough evidence basis for it. So till we have larger evidence, I feel myo-inositol should be considered as an experimental therapy.
Okay, so there are some questions which have come regarding the management of fertility. I must tell all the delegates this today's webinar we have not touched upon the fertility management of either of lean PCOS or obese PCOS. It comes in the subsequent webinars. Tune on to that. So we are only taking questions regarding the management of metabolic or hormonal or clinical profile, and then the weight and diet. So are lean PCOS more difficult to treat than obese PCOS who do better with weight loss? This is Dr. Uma from Gujarat. Are they difficult to treat? Anybody can take up.
The lean PCOS are actually quite easier to treat when compared to the obese PCOS, because the insulin resistance in them, if you compare between the lean and obese, the insulin resistance is quite less among them, as well as the other hormonal parameters, the hyperandrogenism, which is again one of the important pathogenic hallmark of PCOS, is quite significantly less when compared to the obese PCOS. As a result, in terms of fertility parameters as well as in terms of metabolic parameters, the lean PCOS would be quite easy to treat.
Okay. So role of intermittent fasting in PCOS, I think we did cover it. I think probably the delegate must have joined a little later. I think it is helpful. They have a very positive opinion about intermittent fasting in PCOS. And we are not taking questions on infertility and PCOS. So we move on. Okay. Is raised DHEAS correctable? If the DHEAS is high, do you want to correct it or is it correctable?
DHEAS is measured in PCOS for the diagnostic purpose. So really we are not looking to correct hyperandrogenism when you are treating PCOS here. The point here is, as it is PCOS patients, inherently they have higher androgen secretions from the adrenal androgens. That is because of the increased LH, the FSH ratio, that is because of the increased tempo of the pituitary gonadotropins that are secreted. They have a slightly higher DHEAS that is coming from the adrenal gland as well. So with treatment with OCPs, what we do is we suppress the androgens, and again, this suppressions of androgen is temporary. As long as you are giving them OC pills, the androgens are suppressed. The moment you stop the OC pills, the hyperandrogenic state again tends to persist.
Okay. So there's one question from Dr. Purnima. She says, most important reason for PCOD is the gradual developing insulin resistance. But in clinical practice, quite a number of patients having typical PCOS signs and symptoms do not have elevated fasting serum insulin levels, even on repeated lab tests. So when and how to decide on treating these patients with insulin resistance modifying drugs? This is precisely what we answered.
Exactly, ma'am.
Yeah.
Though insulin resistance is an inherent part of PCOS, in most studies, what you see that even with the gold standard euglycemic clamp studies, you find insulin resistance only in around 80% of patients with PCOS, of obese PCOS, and around 50 to 60% of lean PCOS have some evidence of insulin resistance. So the pathophysiology of PCOS does not just depend upon insulin resistance. There are various pathophysiologies which have been postulated for PCOS. Hyperandrogenism is one part. So doesn't necessarily mean that all PCOS patients have an underlying insulin resistance. It could be whether it is hyperandrogenism or insulin resistance which leads to PCOS. Which comes first is like the egg and the chicken theory. We still do not know whether insulin resistance comes first or the hyperandrogenism comes first. So for that reason, it is very clear that insulin resistance may not be seen in all patients with PCOS. And for you to to start metformin or insulin sensitizing drugs in these patients, the indications are very clear. You start them if you have any evidence of impaired glucose tolerance. Second thing is, for menstrual regularity or for hyperandrogenism, these drugs can be started. This can be considered, metformin can be considered second line of therapy if any adolescent or any patient is not willing for OCPs.
Yeah.
So these are the only two indications for metformin. You need not really assess. The take-home message here is you do not have to do a fasting insulin levels in all your patients with PCOS. It is really not needed.
Yeah. So that's what the measurement of insulin level, fasting insulin or postprandial insulin level, and how I mean, what we discussed. I think they missed on that. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, we really do not need to really measuring the fasting insulin levels or assessing insulin resistance in patients with PCOS is not needed, because your treatment decisions are not going to be based on that. Your treatment decisions will be based upon the metabolic parameters, whether they have an import glucose tolerance, and secondly, based upon their clinical profile. If they have oligomenorrhea, if they have hirsutism, and they cannot tolerate OCPs, then metformin can be started. So there is really no point in measuring serum insulin levels other than for research purposes.
Okay. So I think this is for Ruby, dietary counseling in lean PCOS. I think you did talk about it. Can you just quickly repeat it? Dietary counseling in lean PCOS.
So here we are not looking at only at the macronutrient composition for a caloric restriction diet. We are looking at micronutrient composition, including nuts, seeds, low-fat milk, high fiber, high protein diet, and of course a low glycemic index and a low glycemic load diets. That will help it. And definitely a portion control in adjunct with that.
Okay, there's one more question which is asking about something about DEXA to measure body fat percentage. Is anybody using DEXA to, Neeta, can you take up?
Yeah, actually it is the ideal way to measure fat in the body, but it is not always available everywhere. So outside of clinical research protocols, we don't really use DEXA to measure fat in an obesity clinic. But yes, it is a very accurate way of doing it.
Gold standard Shobna is also very expensive. So,
yeah, it's expensive also. That is true.
Expensive. Okay. So bariatric surgery, I don't understand this question. Bariatric surgery still gives tummy and hip fat. What about that?
Bariatric surgery doesn't, the fat reduction in bariatric surgery is uniform all over the body. And the fat loss happens in the reverse order of how you put it on. So people put on the central abdominal fat first, and then the thighs, and then the rest of the body. So in the reverse order it will go. And when the patient's intake and caloric intake and output comes to a balanced level, the weight loss stops at that point. So suppose you have not lost, you have reached that point a little early, then your abdomen and central obesity still continues. But what we are looking at in bariatric surgery is not the location of the fat. We're looking at the resolution of comorbidities and the progression of the comorbidities. That is what we are looking at. So this is, again, confusing bariatric surgery to be a cosmetic. We are not looking at a cosmetic result here. We are looking at a patient being free from all the comorbidities and the progression of those comorbidities.
Okay. So there's a role of keto diet in reducing visceral fat and in treating PCOS women. Role of keto diet.
Keto diet is a very high fat diet. And if the caloric intake of the patient is exceeding the caloric output, then the ketogenic diet will not work. And these are all having short-term outcomes. There are no long-term studies to prove the benefits of these ketogenic diets.
Okay. So can you recommend any body fat analysis machine we can use at home or clinics for guidance? I think this question, I think Neeta and Sheila can take it.
Yeah, I think we're both using a similar kind of machine. That is I'm using the InBody 230. But there are better versions of it now, and it's basically bioimpedance.
Can you repeat? You can't hear it. There was echoing of the voice.
See, InBody 230.
Okay.
But there are other versions of it that have come out now. It is a little expensive, but amongst the lot, it's the cheapest method of measuring the body fat. A 4-lead bioimpedance analysis.
Okay. Okay. So hope you got it. And to Dr. Rajshekhar, please post a link to your paper. If you can.
I have sent it to you on WhatsApp.
Yeah. I think, yeah. From Sheila and MDR to everyone. Okay. Okay. Role of jackfruit powder in patients of type 2 diabetes. Is there any role of jackfruit powder?
It is a very recent. There is a company in South who is actually manufacturing this jackfruit powder, and he's also presented to Prime Minister Modi also. That really helps. And a lot of research is yet to be done before we confirm this. He's really marketing it very well. Everybody knows about it. We still have to experiment with our patients. because it's only one company which is selling it. So for people in Mumbai and Delhi, they'll have to order it, give it to the patients, and see how expensive and how feasible it is for our patients. We'll have to work on some studies.
So I think we have come to the end of the questions, and Ross, a lot of other questions over there are related to fertility. And I think we'll close the question and answer session here. So this is the as we told you earlier, that PCOS is coming up with this W3 series. The next W3 interactive case discussion series on PCOS is on fertility. Let's get the basic right. It's on 20th February at 7 p.m. So we request all of you to tune in again. And I request all of you to become a member of PCOS Society. And there's a lot of benefit being the member of the PCOS Society. And you can become a member of the PCOS Society of India by logging in onto this website. And in case you have missed this webinar, it will all be put up in our website. Please go and then you can watch this webinar. I think we have come to the end of this webinar, and I would definitely take this opportunity to thank everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Durusha for giving us an opportunity to conduct this program. And also, I would like to thank all the panelists who have done such a wonderful job. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So I must thank all of you. I think we had a wonderful discussion and a lot of things we got to learn. And so I think I thank all my panelists, and they have taken time, and they have been so busy, and then they took time, and we have been talking about it and how best we could present this webinar to all of you. And I would also like to thank all the delegates who have logged in. And I would like to thank also USV for the financial support what they've given, and OmniCuris for the technical support. And not the least, Pinali is the manager of the PCO Society, and she has been doing a wonderful job. And I thank her very much wholeheartedly for bringing up this, helping us in conducting this program. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, doctors.